on today's StoryBeat.
I was the least powerful man in Hollywood. I was about to walk in unprepared to pitch my idea for a comedy channel. And that's what we did. But I sat down, did the pitch as best as I could. And Michael liked it because he was a big comedy guy. He loved comedy. He put comedy on HBO before he became chairman. So he set me up as, he says, okay, let's see if this thing can work. And the rest is kind of history.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Art Bell, is a writer and former television executive. While at HBO, Art became known for developing and launching the Comedy Channel, which later became Comedy Central. As president of Court TV, he oversaw daily live courtroom coverage and the production of hundreds of hours of original true crime TV series, documentaries, and movies. Art's memoir, Constant Comedy: How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor, was a finalist in the 2020 Best Book Awards in both the memoir and business categories. Art has had short stories, nonfiction, and satire published in several journals, including the Lowestoft Chronicle, Aethlon, the Journal of Sports Literature, the Ocotillo Review, Fiction Southeast, Castabout Arts and Literature, High Shelf Press, and Writers Read. Art recently published his first novel, What She's Hiding, which I've read and found to be an action-packed legal noir thriller with some terrific surprises and twists. If you like John Grisham, then you'll enjoy What She's Hiding. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a true honor for me to welcome the outstanding author, Art Bell, to StoryBeat today. Art, thanks so much for joining me.
Steve, thanks for having me. It's really fun to be here.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you. So let's go back in time just a little bit. At what age did you first recognize words and writing and entertainment and movies? When did you start into this process that you've been in for most of your life?
Well, I have to say that, comedy was a big part of my life from a very early age. And I think that's what started it. I did my earliest writing, I don't know if it was my earliest, but my writing in around 7th and 8th grade, when I started to say, this is fun, was satire and, kind of short comic pieces. I was really drawn to that whole thing. And then I continued through high school, actually. And I was particularly fascinated with satire. I remember reading Jonathan Swift, and just thinking, man, this guy was good. He's talking about stuff in a very funny way, but changing the world at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And early on, he was one of the earliest pioneers of that sort of style of writing.
Yep, that's for sure.
Did you also admire the satirists of your era? So Mad Magazine and so on. Was that something for you?
I don't know who it was, said Mad Magazine is the source of all humor. And I sort of subscribe to that view. Yes, Mad Magazine was always on my desk. National Lampoon, those were the great days, the early days of National Lampoon.
And do you think that people could get away with that today if they were starting it today?
That's an interesting question. Again, National Lampoon, well, Mad Magazine for sure, that was considered real underground stuff for a long time. As in, you're not supposed to show it in school because they take it away. I had somebody approach me once and say, does your mother know you're reading that? I think it was Mad Magazine. I said, I think so. But anyway, this was real, almost contraband. So could they get away with it today? I think they could get away with it today if it remained contraband. But by the time, National Lampoon, they kind of gave it up. It persisted through the movies and everything else. But in the glory days, I think that they had become kind of nationally known and nationally noticed. And that may have been the reason it folded when it did.
Mm-hmm. Who were you looking at in movies and TV for comedy? Who were your heroes?
Oh, well, it goes way back to the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, I know you were we're not exactly the same age, but we're close. So you probably remember the Ed Sullivan Show.
Oh, extremely well.
And one of my early memories is sitting in front of the television with my father and my brother, watching the Ed Sullivan Show. And one of the Borscht Belt comics came out. I think it was Alan King. And my father was hysterical, laughing. The audience was laughing. And I realized that I didn't know the number, but 30 million people watching this guy and laughing. And I thought, wow, how powerful is this comedy thing? I really did. And I wanted to learn more about it. And I was very young. I was, like 6 or 7. And then I watched all the great comics. I watched Richard Pryor's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, it was a riot. He was like 20 years old, and he was so funny. And he was talking about getting beat up on the playground, which was a concept I knew pretty well by then. And so it really kind of touched me. And he looked so nervous while he was delivering, which was part of his act. He wasn't nervous, but he was just like, looking around and just, like somebody's going to come at him at any second. And I realized that was a really great way to deliver comedy.
Well, it seemed harmless. He seemed harmless, but yet what he was delivering was actually in a way subversive.
That's true. Even on the Ed Sullivan Show, it was a little subversive. But, thinking back to the stuff on the Ed Sullivan Show, Jackie Mason was on. He got into big trouble on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Flip the bird.
Yeah, flip the bird. That's true. And a lot of the stuff that was on was, a lot of the comedy in those days would not be comedy today. I mean, Alan King talking about his mother-in-law constantly, in kind of a derogatory ways. But, I thought that was fascinating stuff.
You said something interesting just now, which I rarely explore on this show, but I'd love to talk about. What do you think happens? Is it culture? Is it society? Is it history? What causes something like comedy, which continues to evolve over a long period of time and goes from one sort of sensibility to a completely different sensibility and abandons the old sensibility in a way where it's almost verboten anymore? How does that happen?
Well, I think people are looking for breakthroughs in entertainment all the time. What can we see that's different? Now, the comedy that I grew up on originally was pretty much Borscht Belt comedy, Alan King and those guys. And the older stuff, Three Stooges, Abbott and Costello. I mean, that stuff came out of, I guess, more of a vaudeville mentality. The Marx Brothers, listen, I say that with all kinds of love for these things. I mean, I read all that stuff. I read about them. I read the scripts. I performed the Who's on First routine in college with a friend of mine, which is a funny story. Just a small digression. We got up there to do it, and we had practiced like forever. And the audience moaned because they figured they knew it, right? And then we did it, and it's so good that everybody went nuts. Everybody really loved it. And it is a perfect routine. So the breakthrough that, we kind of know in comedy as the big breakthrough was when people stopped talking about, their mother-in-laws and their bosses and everything else and started talking about themselves. Richard Pryor talking about his life as an African-American and American, what was going on. The Carlin, for sure, the political comedians. Mort Saw was, certainly talking about stuff that nobody else. I mean, Lenny Bruce, who kind of took it to its limit. I mean, he ended up not being funny at the end because he was talking so personally. But, those things really kind of punched a hole in the old comedy and became the new comedy. I don't think we've deviated too much from that in recent years. I don't. I think it's been a pretty good through line from the 60s through now.
So we're talking about comedy here. I want to get us to how you became an executive at HBO and then obviously created the Comedy Channel. What did you do in your life? Did you go to school to learn to be in business, or were you a lawyer? What did you do in school?
I think this is going to surprise you. I was an economics major in undergraduate school.
That doesn't surprise me.
I was fascinated by it. And my first job out of school was as an economist at a consulting firm in Washington. And I worked with the smartest people there. I mean, it was just a great experience. And one day I'm sitting there reading Coal Weekly because I was working on coal transportation problems and
As one does.
as one does when you're an economist in Washington. And I had my feet up on the desk and I'm reading Coal Weekly, and I threw the thing down and said, I can't do this for the rest of my life. I just can't get interested in Coal Weekly. So I thought about what I wanted to do. And I said, you know what? I'd really like to go into the entertainment business, which I guess has been said millions of times by millions of people.
But you had not given that a real thought prior to then.
Well, that's not entirely true. In undergrad, and when I was an undergraduate, I hung around with the other kids in undergraduate school who wanted to go into the entertainment business. And I kept saying, hey, you know, you're going to LA to be a writer. You're never going to get work. You're going to starve to death. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to get a real job. I'm going to be an economist. But, you know, I was still, you know, I was hanging out with these guys who were doing, you know, comedy and writing comedy and performing comedy. As I said, I did those on first thing. But, you know, a lot of these guys, and one of my best friends, who's still a best friend, went to LA, started out as something other than comedy writers, but ended up comedy writers and ended up very successful. So it's not like I had no experience thinking about whether I should go into the entertainment industry. I just always thought about what my parents would say, which is, you'll never make a living, which is what I told my friends. You'll never make a living. My parents said so.
Well, you know better than most that 99% of everyone doesn't make a living at it.
Yes, I do know that better than most.
You know, it's a tiny percentage that the very small number of people actually are able to make a living at it. Many people will have a job or two or six, but can't make a living at it. It's almost impossible sometimes. And so those that do, that's a really big deal. So now, how did you then get into being an executive? How did that happen?
Okay, so here it is. I went to business school. I wish somebody had told me you don't have to go to business school to get into the entertainment business.
You don't have to go to any school to get into the entertainment.
As a matter of fact, school works against you if you're trying to get into the entertainment business. But I thought, okay, I'm going to, you know, I want to learn about business and I want to get into the entertainment business. So I'm going to go to business school. So I went to business school. And on my first day there, I said, hey, you know, I'm kind of interested in the entertainment business. You know, a little artsier. Where do people like me in this, I went to Wharton grad school. Where do people hang out? You know, people like me. And the woman I was talking to said, well, there's this thing called the Wharton Follies. And all the people who come out of like theater and music and are trying to get to Wall Street and figure they have to learn something about business, they come here, but they put on a show every year. You know, and it's obviously a rotating group of people, but why don't you go see what they're up to? So I did. And man, it was really interesting because these people were in fact very talented people who'd been in the entertainment industry and wanted to get out of it. And so we were kind of passing each other in the night. I did the Follies for 2 years. The second year I was a head writer. I did a lot of the writing. I wrote a lot of really funny stuff. And at the end of that experience, when people were saying, you know, that was really kind of very well done, you know, very professional, I said, you know, maybe I do know something about writing and comedy. Anyway, I took that concept with me when I started looking for a job. I graduated from Wharton and I started looking for a job. And I first thing I noticed was there was a music channel, there was a news channel, there was a sports channel, there was no comedy channel. And this was in the early 80s, right? So I ended up getting a job at CBS, which unfortunately at that time was like working at the post office. I mean, it was just a horrible experience for me, you know, layers and layers of stuff. I was working I got hired as a financial analyst because, you know, that was my strength sort of at that point. And I was doing reports and I went into my boss one day and I said, you know, I do this report. It takes me 6 weeks to do it or a month to do it. And I went around and asked people if they ever use it. And they say, no, they throw it out. I said, well, you know, why don't we do something useful? And she said, look, we've been doing this way for like the last 8 years. We're not going to change now. And I knew at that point I wasn't going to stay there. Luckily, a friend of mine called me and said, hey, come on over to HBO. They're looking for somebody with your kind of background, who knows something about economics and econometrics. And man, that was the last thing I wanted to do. But HBO was like Netflix in those days. It was the cool place to work in the entertainment business.
That was still fairly early on in the HBO years, yeah?
We're talking 1983, 1984. And it went up on the satellite in, I believe, 1977 or something. So it was fairly new. And the concept of bringing this kind of television into people's homes, uncut movies and all that kind of stuff, it hadn't been duplicated, So they had the place to themselves for the moment. And my friend called me up and he said, the people walk around here and they say, we are going to change television. It's a very exciting place to work. So naturally, I went, I applied for the job, I got it. And they said, okay, all you have to do is build a model to forecast subscribers over the next 10 years. Because the last guy who did it messed it up terribly and ended up getting fired. So I said, okay, no pressure, right? And that was my first job there.
And so how did you then move up into the ranks? This is a valuable lesson for listeners.
I made myself visible in the organization by doing this forecasting. I knew it was going to be a high profile thing. And when I gave kind of like a final presentation, there were a lot of executives in the room. And one of the executives came up to me and said, hey, I'm the head of new business development. Why don't you come work for me? And previously I was in something, some financial area. And I said, yeah, great. I'll come work for you. What are you doing? She said, well, we're working on a new channel idea. I said, really? What is it? She said, it's called Festival. And Festival is going to be a channel for people who don't buy HBO because they don't like the sex, violence, and language on television. So it's kind of a clean HBO. I said, okay, that sounds great. And I got the job, and I took the job, and I started working. And on the second day of my job, I said, I've been thinking about this television with no sex, violence, and bad language. I said, isn't that pretty much why people watch television? Because they want that kind of excitement. And she said, shh, don't say that again, okay? So Festival, after about 8 months, bombed, as you can imagine. It was just like not a great idea. And we tried our hardest. So I was left without a job in new business development. And I thought they would fire me, but they said, no, we don't fire people here. We want you to stay. We'll keep you around. We'll give you some projects or something. I said, okay. But I thought I was going to get fired. So I kept thinking about this comedy channel idea, which I had mentioned to people. Like, why is there no comedy channel? And they said, well, it's too hard. It's writer intensive. It's going to be expensive, blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay. But then when I had no job, I said, well, I better get my resume together. And I decided to write up a proposal for the Comedy Channel and send it with my resume to MTV Networks. I thought they would be interested in it, right? But before I did that, I said, I better pitch it to somebody here. So I called up the office of the head of programming at HBO. Her name was Bridget, and she was a very scary person to someone like me. So I did get an appointment with her. She said, yeah, her secretary said, yeah, she'll see you tomorrow. So I went down there and I say, Bridget, I want to pitch you this idea. I think there should be a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week comedy channel, all comedy. Now, HBO is known for comedy, so I think HBO is the one to do it. And she said, Arthur. She called me Arthur for no apparent reason. My mother calls me Arthur. That's pretty much it. Anyway, she says, Arthur. That is the worst idea I've ever heard. There is no way that there can be a 24-hour, 7-day. Who wants to watch that much comedy? And she said, you'd have to get really the highest. You'd have to get Robin Williams. You'd have to get Whoopi Goldberg. You'd have to get Billy Crystal in order to make it successful. And they're not going to do a comedy channel. Their managers would die before they'd let them do a comedy. She went on for about 10 minutes telling me why there would be no comedy. Whoopi, Billy, Robin, no, they're not going to do it. I didn't say anything. I just, she didn't even let me continue with my pitch. And at the end, she said, okay, Arthur, thank you for coming down. You obviously this is a true story. She said, "You obviously know nothing about television or comedy. So see you around." So I walked out, and I remember walking out saying, thank you. And I just thought she was wrong. I just thought she was wrong. So I went back upstairs. I kept working on my project of writing up this idea for a comedy channel that I was going to staple to my resume. And what happened? My boss's boss came by and says, "What are you working on? You have nothing to do." I said, "Well, I'm actually writing up a proposal for a channel." He says, "Well, let me see." So he takes a look at it, reads it, says, "This is great." I said, "Oh, thank you." He said, "Have you pitched it to Bridget, the head of the program?" I said, she didn't see it as great. She didn't like it at all. He said, "Yeah, that figures." He says, "But, I think the chairman of HBO should see this." I said, "Really? That's great. I'll get a presentation." He said, No, let's just go down there right now." Now, the chairman of HBO at the time was Michael Fuchs. He had just been on the cover of New York Times Magazine, and the headline was "The Most Powerful Man in Hollywood." I was the least powerful man in Hollywood. I was about to walk in unprepared to pitch my idea for a comedy channel. And that's what we did. My boss's boss walked me in there and says, "Art has a good idea." Michael Fuchs' first comment was, "You guys should really make an appointment when you want to see the chairman of a company." I said, "Wow, that's a bad start. That's really a bad start." But I sat down, did the pitch as best as I could. And Michael liked it because he was a big comedy guy. He loved comedy. He put comedy on HBO before he became chairman. So he set me up as, he says, "Okay, let's see if this thing can work." And the rest is kind of history, but, it's a long story. You can read about it in my book. But that is how I got into the comedy business and became an executive.
Well, I think that it's remarkable that she didn't see it at all now, of course, in retrospect, clearly it's more than just a little viable. But even if it didn't exist, it seems to me, if you just thought about it a little bit, even if you gathered up lots of old comedy movies and put them on for a while, that would at least sustain you. And old comedy shows, TV shows, that would sustain you for a while till you develop new stuff. So, to me, that just sounds like a natural.
And that was part of my pitch because we had to do it cheap. Everybody figured, okay, if you're going to do 24 hours of original comedy, it's going to cost a fortune. That wasn't the idea.
And there were hundreds of comedy shows at that point, sitcoms.
I know. And we got a lot of them. And interestingly, we attracted, I remember one time we did an Abbott and Costello stunt, 24 hours, just Abbott and Costello. And I don't know if everybody knows this, but Seinfeld was a big Abbott and Costello fan. And we knew this because our talent person knew this and called him up and said, "Hey, you want to host this Abbott and Costello thing?" And he said, yes. That's how we got, the big stars on the channel in the early days because they loved the old stuff. They knew it.
Well, it made the channel then cool. It was irrelevant, and in that it was something that if you were sort of not avant-garde, but in the cool kids section, you would not have a problem turning that channel on. It wasn't musty and fusty. It was kind of cool. So I think that's a really good way to go. Now, how do you get 180 degrees from the comedy channel to court TV? I can't think. So to me, it seems that some court cases are clearly hilarious, and some comedies are really a crime. But that's another story. How do you get from Comedy Central or Comedy Channel to doing court TV? How's that work?
Well, I got fired from Comedy Central.
That's a way.
After being there as, head of programming and marketing for 8 years. And I know what people in your audience are saying. Like, what do you have to do to keep a job in this business? How about you start the channel?
Yes.
No, that's not good enough. That's not going to have you keep your job. I mean, they fired the president. I was working for the president, and they brought a new guy in, and the new guy said, "I can't have you here because you're with the old guy."
That's Hollywood, by the way, isn't it? The new regimes always kick out the old regimes.
Really? And you know what the guy said? He said, "You got your fingerprints all over the place. I can't have you here." I said, "All right." And that was the end of that. So I was without a job. I was fired for the first time in my life. And, you have to get used to being fired if you're in the entertainment industry. But this was the first time, and I took it very personally. But I did go around to, I had friends in the industry, and they kind of helped me out. And one very highly placed guy in the industry said, "You know what, Art, if you don't get fired once in a while in the entertainment industry, it means you weren't doing anything worthwhile. You weren't making an impression. You weren't doing anything but keeping your head down, because that's how you keep a job.
You weren't moving the needle.
You weren't moving the needle." And that made me feel a little bit better, but I still didn't have a job. So I worked, I consulted to a number of channels for a few years. And then, as it turns out, somebody who used to work at HBO called me up and said, "Look, I want to interview you because I was just made chairman of this channel, Court TV, which is a failing channel. They're going to close it down, but they're giving it one more shot." So I went to interview with him. He said, "Okay, here's the thing. I don't know anything about cable television or cable channels and how to make them and run them. That'll be your job." He said, "My job is to work the outside and take all the credit." I said, "Okay, sounds like a good deal." And that's what we did until he left the channel and I became president. So,
and what was your background in order to be able to even think about law and lawyers? You didn't have a law degree.
Let me tell you, I had absolutely no background other than I'd read a lot of, mysteries, thrillers, legal thrillers, and watched Perry Mason when that was on. You know what I mean?
Oh, well, that obviously qualifies you.
That makes everybody a lawyer. But anyway, I had no background in this. And let me tell you something. When I walked into the comedy business, people said, "What do you know about comedy?" And I said, "Nothing." When I walked into Court TV, I walked into what was basically a newsroom. These people were journalists who had been at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and Time Magazine and all these places. They were professionals. I walked into the newsroom and I could just feel them saying to themselves, "What does this guy know about what we do? He's not a journalist. He's not a lawyer. He doesn't know this kind of television. He's from comedy. This is like the wrong guy." And that was, that was my introduction.
And what did you do to overcome that?
I had to, get these people on my side by, first of all, not doing anything dramatic. You mentioned that people walk into new places and fire everybody. I wasn't going to take that approach because, as you pointed out, I didn't know that much about it. And I wanted to see who was doing a good job, who wasn't, what was going on, how they did things and all that. So I just, basically sat back and watched and listened to these people talk about what they did. And, when you listen to people, they think you're smart. I mean, how's that for a pro tip right there? I mean, they don't think you're smart when you tell them when you walk in exactly how you should do things. They think you're stupid. So I listened and I got the lay of the land. And being smart when you're around journalists is like, the number one qualification. You can't be stupid. And so that's how I eventually, I think, got them on my side. And they were also worried about not only their jobs, but that I was going to turn the channel into something ugly.
I think the listeners should pay very close attention to what Art just said. It's notorious that great leaders are unafraid to have people who know more than them around them. And to learn from the people that you surround yourself with. That sounds like what you did there. And it's also really important that you go into a job and not be the bully and take over. And that just shows insecurity, I think. I think you go in and you absorb what you can from those that are there because they know whatever they know personally, plus whatever they know professionally. So learning from others is a very important factor, I think, if you're going to run an organization.
Right. And I had the added burden of getting them on my side because I wanted them to help me. And ultimately, that's what happened. I mean, the people started saying, "Well, here's what we really want to do. And here's a good idea. And that's another thing I found. This was my, when I was at comedy, I wasn't executive. I was a vice president, senior vice president, whatever. But those were early executive jobs for me. But when I went to Court TV, I felt like more of a seasoned executive. Like I could really figure out how to do this. And I didn't feel as scared, essentially, about doing a good job. And And I ended up, I think, doing a better job for that reason. I just knew I could do it.
You also brought a perspective to that job that is unusual and not expected. It's an unexpected thing that you did. So therefore, you had a way of looking at it that no one else did, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, that was especially true in this case. The channel, Court TV, had been started by a lawyer who was a journalist, the head of American Lawyer, which is a big journal for lawyers. He knew nothing about television, which is why the thing was failing. He put cameras in daytime courtroom and covered daytime courtroom exclusively. And then at night, he ran it over again. The first thing you learn in the television business, cable television, is it's prime time where you make the money. I mean, daytime is not going to do that much for you. So I walked in and essentially said, okay, look, we're going to keep the courtroom coverage. We're going to keep the focus on the justice system, but we're going to look at crime too, because that's the other side of the situation. So we became a channel of crime and justice, and we started doing true crime documentaries and putting those on prime time. And guess what? We got ratings, we got advertisers, and things started going well.
You did a remarkably smart thing, obviously, and that is you put conflict into your primetime programming. It became conflict filled, and that's what people want to see. Going back to when they did not want to have sex, drugs, and rock and roll on HBO, on what'd you call it? What was the channel? The festival channel. So they wanted no conflict. Like this show. This show is a conflict-free show, StoryBeat. But that's not its intention. Its intention is to inform. If you're going to do court TV, it has to have conflict in it, right?
That's right. And to be fair, courtroom can be pretty exciting once every 10,000 minutes. I mean, that was the problem. I mean, the big action in courtroom was just not, there wasn't enough of it to sustain. So again, we kept the courtroom coverage. And I got to tell you, that was, people say, how did you go from comedy to court? It was a very exciting time for me because I learned so much about the criminal justice system. I mean, I ended up working with cops and detectives and lawyers by the thousands and journalists. I never had worked with journalists before. I mean, it was a really interesting place to be in the television universe. And then I started, when you're running things, you get to do crazy things. And so I decided, because I loved mystery and thriller novels, I decided we were going to do a show like that about mysteries and thrillers, only because I wanted to have lunch with some of these writers. And that's what I did.
That's such a great segue into where I was headed next anyway, which is your book. And so you already mentioned earlier about your love of mysteries, and now you're further saying it that you loved it so much that you managed to get it into court TV as well. How did you ever decide, okay, I'm now going to sit down and write a mystery, which is a task. It's a real, you have to be very smart about it because you've got to know what the plot is very, very thoroughly. How did that come about? How did you get into writing?
I had retired from the business because I was kind of done with it. I had been doing consulting for a few years after I left corporate, which was really fun. But I decided that I was tired of it. I was done. And I always wanted to write, and I had done some writing. And when you're in the television business, you end up writing something once in a while. So it was my wife who suggested, why don't you go take a course at Sarah Lawrence College? Now, people say you can't learn writing, and I disagree.
Oh, well, you're absolutely right. You can learn writing. You can't learn talent. You can develop talent, but you can't learn talent.
I think that's a great way to put it, Steve. Anyway, so I said, okay, I'm going to go take a class in writing. And they told me at Sarah Lawrence, the first thing I should do, and this is good advice for anybody, is take a class in memoir, because you want to write memoir. And the reason you want to write memoir first is because you know the stories. You've been telling these stories. And I love telling stories. I was always telling stories, funny stories, stupid stories, sad stories. So yeah, that was a good place for me to start. And I wrote some memoirs, short memoir stuff, got some stuff published. Then I wrote the big memoir. And the way I wrote the big memoir about comedy was I was in class. I read a story about Comedy Central, actually it was Comedy Channel, where the head writer at Comedy Channel was angry at me because he said I didn't know anything about comedy. And he said, I want your job and I want to talk about it with you. And I said, you're not getting my job. He says, well, meet me for lunch. And he told me where to meet him for lunch. So I'm in my tie and jacket. He's in his, T-shirt because he's a writer. And I walk into this place and it's a strip club. That's where he had made reservations. And there was nobody there but me and this guy, Eddie, and the stripper. And we sat right up in front. And I know why Eddie did that. He wanted to disarm me. That was the whole reason for him to do it. But anyway, I wrote that story up, and it's a funny story. And people, people who'd been sleeping through my other stuff kind of like woke up and said, hey, wow, that's great. Why don't you do more on comedy? And that's how I ended up doing the book. I just wrote a lot of stories. But I will say this, it's not just a string of stories. You can't do that. You have to write a memoir like a novel. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end. It has to have conflict. It has to have characters. You have to make characters out of the people in your lives. You can't just, introduce them and hope that they're going to sing as characters. You really have to work it. And so that was great. A great education for me.
Well, you could write a memoir and have it be episodic, but it should have some kind of a through line. It should have a definite rhythm and flow throughout the whole thing. And so, that's the difference between great memoirs and ones that are not so memorable. What do you think you learned all those years as an executive that helped you to be a good writer?
Listen, these channels were schools in lots of different things. I mean, comedy was a school in the comedy business for one thing. But it was really Court TV that fueled my interest in writing the novel.
And gave you a lot of information to use in the novel, I assume.
Information and really an understanding of how the criminal justice system worked. But even before then, I always point out that there were some things that I did in high school that informed this novel. One is, I loved noir as a kid. We've been talking about mysteries and thrillers, but the classic noir, the Maltese Falcon, the Postman Always Rings Twice, the Big Sleep, and those things were made into movies. And the movies mostly relied on the snappy dialogue from the books.
100%.
Which was brilliant. It was part of their brilliance. But I really I didn't study noir, but I really got a sense of what noir was. So when I decided I was going to write fiction, first I wrote some short stories, but when I decided I was going to write something that was kind of noirish, I went back and read noir. And I learned about noir. And one of the things I learned was there are also romances. So I had to really kind of think about, okay, I'm going to write a noirish kind of thing. I want it to be current, and I want it to have a romance.
And frequently quite sexy, not just romance.
Well, sex, that's a whole nother thing.
It is.
Of course they're sexy. Of course they're about adultery as well as murder. I mean, yeah, really sexy.
So who were you reading? James M. Cain and Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett?
Yeah, James M. Cain, Raymond Chandler, Dash Hammett was, I think, my introduction to noir. Now, he didn't write a whole lot of stuff. He didn't have a big volume of stuff, but he wrote the short stories of the Continental Op, which they're brilliant. These things brilliant. They stand up even today. I mentioned The Postman Always Rings Twice, Double Indemnity. It's basically the same concept where a bad woman leads a nice guy into a really horrible situation. She wants him to kill her husband for whatever reason. And I loved that. I loved they ended up calling it a femme fatale. They weren't always femme fatales in that they weren't always gorgeous, but they were attractive to these guys. And they made the guys or either do bad things or they got them into trouble.
Certainly true in Double Indemnity, big time.
Yeah. This woman wanted this guy to help her kill her husband so they could collect the insurance. Mm-hmm. I don't want to do any spoilers on these things because I think everybody in your audience should go run out and get the thing and read it if they haven't. It's classic.
Or watch Mr. Wilder's great version of it.
Yes,
with Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck. It's just a tremendous movie, and the dialogue in that thing just snaps. I mean, it's just as snappy as can be.
Well, that snappy dialogue is what that's what I wanted to write. Remember, I'd written some satire. I'd written some, some comedy stuff. I wanted that snappy. I wanted to be an author who did snappy dialogue.
Well, I think you achieved that. Did you do anything to develop your voice in that? Was there anything that you practiced at? I mean, that's a sort of a skill set.
You know what? I don't think so. I think I learned how to write a novel while I was writing a novel. It didn't really start out as a novel.
That's a theme in your life, isn't it, Art? You learn as you're going. You just jump into things and go.
Yeah. And it's a crazy way to live. And it doesn't always work. And I'm proud of that. So I started writing this novel, and you mentioned, okay, it's hard to write a novel like this because you gotta think about the plot, twists, and everything like that. And I learned what I did was, remember I said I was really drawn to those characters bad women who dragged nice guys into horrible situations. I wanted to do that. And I wrote the first scene in my novel where a woman walks in to a lawyer's office, her ex-husband, and says, I'm in a lot of trouble. I need money, and you're in trouble too. And that's all I knew about the book. That's all I knew about the book. And he didn't believe her until it became clear that she was right, that someone was after both of them. And he didn't even know why. So that's where it started. No plot. I don't know if you've talked to writers about this, but I found out, I thought I was the only one who wrote like this. Like, okay, I'm just going to write and see what happens. No, about half the novelists in the world write like this. We're called pantsers, which means we write by the seat of our pants. Plotters, they have 10,000 index cards behind them. They write everything up on their index cards. They write from scene to scene. Sounded like too much work for me. So I was a pantser. And as I said, I thought I was the only guy in the world who did this, but turns out everybody did, or half the people did. And I really just kept writing with that setup to see what happened. I wanted to see how this guy would handle mortal violence for the first time. And there was one other influence on that. I read an article when I was in high school called The Violence That Finds You. And it was written by a guy named Harry Cruz. It was in Esquire. And I always thought of it because he was a writer. He went to Wyoming or something, and he was in a bar, and some guy wanted to fight, and he didn't want to fight, but he ended up having to fight. And he said, sometimes you just get into situations where there's violence, and you got to deal. And I always thought about that. And so I was going to bring that into it too.
There's nothing better in storytelling. Well, as a storyteller of any kind, you need the audience to always be in suspense. They need to not know what's coming next. You, the writer, at some point need to know what's coming next because you're writing it, you're creating it. But you didn't plot it. You didn't plot it out. I'm a plotter. I'm an outliner. You do it. I've talked to many people on this show who do not. And I find that fascinating because I don't know how to do that. I would find myself down dead end alleys. Did you find that you got lost in places where you had to sort of abandon it and do something else?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But before we get to that, let me tell you the good part about it. Characters show up and you don't even know who they are or what they are, but then suddenly you like them. And you say, wait a second, this character is great. I'm going to keep him or her in this novel. So that's the good part. You kind of trip over great things. But as you point out, the bad part is you write yourself into a corner all the time.
And sometimes that's a good thing because you have to work your way out of the corner, and that makes it interesting.
I'm telling you, I was up at 3 a.m. plenty of times saying, how am I going to get my character out of this mess? Or there was one time I had to get the character into a cab with another guy so we could interview him, basically ask him questions about the crime. And I said, how am I going to get these guys into a cab? The guy doesn't want to get in a cab. How am I going to do it? And I had to figure out how I was going to do it. Now, I will say this. I was lucky. I did not have to go back and rewrite stuff. I talked to a lot of people, pantsers, who end up saying, I ended up here, so I had to go back and rewrite this stuff. Again, lazy. I did not want to do that.
That's remarkable, Art. As I have taught many people, which I truly believe in, that the first draft is a craft thing. You're drafting a first draft, and the art comes, the real storytelling comes in the revisions. You're saying you didn't do that.
No. Please don't misunderstand me. This thing got rewritten 47 times.
Oh, great. Okay.
Edited to death and changed and scenes added and everything else. What I'm saying is, I didn't get to a point where I said, okay, all this stuff is happening, but the first part of the book doesn't really kind of lead to this. And so I got to go rewrite all that stuff.
Right. Sure.
Or the character didn't carry through. So,
well, many novelists will get 100 pages into a book and realize that the book doesn't start till page 101, and they abandon the first 100 pages and start the book on 101. That's not what you did.
That's not what I did. And I was so glad. But I tell you what I did find. I found, as I said, I was learning how to write a novel. When I went back to the early parts and started editing, I said, wait a second, I got to be a better writer in the second half of as the book went on, the book got better. And so I did rewrite, I kept the concepts of the scenes and the characters and everything else, but I did a lot of adjusting and rewriting and everything else.
Well, it's like going to the gym. You got more muscular as you went. And the more and more you write, the better you are as a writer. That's just the way it works. It is a lot like an athlete, only with your brain. And you do get stronger as you write. So let's go back a half a step. Tell the listeners what She's Hiding is really about. What happens?
Okay, well, I told you the setup. This woman walks in. She says, if you don't give me a lot of money, they said they're going to kill me. And he doesn't believe her. And then he throws her out of his office. This is his ex-wife. And as she's leaving, she says, and they're going to kill you too. He goes home that night, not believing her, didn't give it a second thought. And his place was trashed. So now he's got to find her. He doesn't know where she is because it's his ex. And he's got to figure out who's looking for them, what the problem is, why they're looking for him too, and get them both out of this mess. That's what the book is about. It goes on from there. I mean, I don't know how much you want me to get into, but he ends up asking his best friend for help, who helps him a little bit and offers his private detective to help him. And that's Gabriella. The main character's name is Henry. And Gabriella and Henry are a great team.
A great team. She's a terrific character.
And that's a case where she showed up. She showed up in a phone call. She was just calling him up to say, hey, my boss, Aiden, told me to give you a call because you have a problem with your ex-wife or something. And he hangs up on her, essentially. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But she didn't give up. And that's what I liked about her. And she ends up helping him. She's tough and knows what she's doing. And he's a wimp and doesn't know what he's doing. And he's scared. But he knows he's got to do it. And that's how the book proceeds.
What's one of the things I really enjoyed about the story a lot is that your protagonist, Henry, is really not a heroic guy, but he becomes heroic.
Thank you for noticing. Not everybody, I do book clubs all the time, so I get to talk to people about the book. And I love doing that. And a lot of times they say, well, I don't know, did Henry really change? And I say, yes. I have to describe it. Henry ended up not being a wimp to the same extent. And that's the kind of change you want to see in a character.
Well, there's no question. That's called a character arc. He goes from a want to a need, and he becomes a different person in doing so. He grows in a way, whether he likes it or not. And that's what his learning process is. So you learned, obviously, a lot about. He's a lawyer, and you learned a lot about the law and lawyering and so on from Court TV. How much of your background in Court TV is in the book?
Well, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I was guessing at what corporate law was all about, but I did know what lawyers think about. But even more from Court TV, I'll tell you what I took. We did documentaries with some of the finest documentary filmmakers, the guys who are winning Oscars these days. They were kids then. But they were doing some really great documentary work. And what do you have to do in a documentary? You have to tell a story, beginning, middle, and end, story arc, build the characters into interesting characters, not just people in a tough situation. And I learned all of that from them. I watched them piece together what were essentially, entertainment shows from real life. And I thought, that's cool. So I learned how to tell a story from those people. Honestly, it was the most It was the best education I could get in that.
I think that's fantastic. And the listener should understand that, again, Art has said something incredibly valuable. I've had a handful of documentary filmmakers on this podcast, and all of them, and it's the truth, they're all storytellers, and they all need to follow the basic plotting of most movies. I believe in the 7 plot points, and they all follow that. They have a beginning, middle, and end, and there's an arc that you follow. And if you don't, you'll lose the audience quickly. And so that's what you want to do, is sell the story in the way that people accept storytelling.
Right. Now you're talking about the big overall effort. The other thing to keep in mind is scenes. You want every scene to have conflict. You have to know what characters want in every scene, because if nobody wants anything, it's a dead scene. I tried to make every scene in the book interesting. Now, I don't know if I succeeded, but what I hate is reading a book and having it sag in the middle. And I did not want to do that. So I tried to make every scene interesting. Yeah, that was my education from Court TV that helped me write this book.
All right. So your process, we've already talked about your process a little bit, which I find very interesting. When you started, did you have Henry in mind at the start? Since you didn't have your story worked out, where did Henry come from?
Okay. As you pointed out, I've known lawyers in my life, and I've had friends who are lawyers. Henry is not based on any one particular friend or one particular lawyer, but I knew I wanted him to be a lawyer. And as I started writing, I realized I had to give him a little bit of a backstory. Now, I knew a couple of things about Henry. He was divorced, and he still loved his ex-wife. He still carried the torch. That's all I knew in the first few pages. But that was a lot. That was a lot to build a character around. And then, I started thinking about his background. Where did he grow up? How did he grow up? Who were his influences? I had one really bad influence on him. He was like the cool guy in high school that everybody knows he's a bad guy, but they want to hang out with him anyway. And he had that kind of influence. I wanted him to have to face some tough choices and have to make, some real big moral decisions about what to do next. So, listen, all I can say is I developed the character as I was writing. And after a while, 40 or 50 pages in, it's like, oh, I know this guy. I know him. I'm thinking about him. I can have lunch with him. Now, I found it more difficult to do his ex-wife.
Well, you describe her, and I'm going to quote, someone who took life by the balls and lived dangerously, close quote. That's how you describe her. So that tells you a whole lot in one very brief sentence.
Yeah, that was her. And I liked the combination of her and Henry, who did not live dangerously.
Mm-hmm.
He did not want the dangerous life. So why did he marry her? Because he liked the fact that she could make his life interesting, make his life more dangerous. That's why he married. That's why he was attracted to her, and that's why he married her. He married her, and that's why he missed her.
He missed the excitement of being around her, didn't he?
That's right.
Because his life was not all that exciting to begin with. So how much research did you then do on like the Russian mafia? You have all kinds of things going on in your book that I don't see any of that from your particular personal history. Did you have to do research to get there?
We go back to the laziness thing. I did a little bit of research. I didn't do much on the Russian mafia because, I figure most readers aren't well versed in the Russian mafia themselves. So I could make up the Russian mafia and the characters. And listen, we've all seen mafia shows and read mafia books and have some sense of what these people are like. They're psychopaths, They appear charming, but are, in the next minute will be happy to kill you. Thank you very much.
And with a smile on their face.
Yeah, exactly. So, so that's how I developed those characters. And there was some more Russian stuff I did have to do some research on. And I don't want to give too much away about the book, but you know what I'm talking about.
Well, you don't need to give anything away. Did you do the research by going to a library or mostly online?
Well, truthfully, I knew a little bit about what I was researching, what I was talking about. So I think I just filled in some facts by looking online. And then I did actually check into a book at one point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think that your book and I guarantee you've thought of this, your book would make an excellent movie or series, a mini series. Have you gone down that road and tried to sell it that way?
That's a dirty road.
It is certainly a difficult road, no question.
No, it is a difficult road. And I know people in the business, but, and I tried to get the attention of some of them. It's hard to get their attention. Listen, you did some producing, right? Selling an idea, selling a show is about the hardest thing you have to do. My boss once said, the hardest thing that anybody has to do is get a movie made. If you get a movie made, you're a genius, because it's hard to do. So many people write script after script after script, screenplay after screenplay. Nothing happens. They get paid for it, but the movie never gets made.
You now have what I think of from a marketing perspective as a lost leader. You have the book, and the book exists. It's in the world. It's for sale. People have bought it and commented on it and been reviewed. And now you're on this show talking about it. And I know you've done others. And so it's a real thing. It's not it's not an imaginary thing that a writer's sitting in a room and trying to sell their story to someone whole cloth. You have an existing property. So that's an advantage, don't you think?
I think it is. But producers or agents or whomever you're trying to pitch, they're inundated with this stuff. And that's what I was told. Now, I will tell everybody a secret. This book was not on the bestseller list. I sold a lot of books and people liked it. And I'm still selling a lot of books. But it was not a bestseller. And a lot of producers look to the bestsellers because they have built-in audiences. Everybody's going to want to see the movie. What this book does have that I think would make it, and by the way, every time I do a book group or every time I talk to people about this book, they always say, so is this going to be a Netflix series or what are you working on here? And I say, it's hard to get Netflix's attention. And I will continue to try, Steve, because I think the characters are really, really worthy of carrying a television show, really able to carry a television show. Anybody who wants to help out there in podcast land, please give me a call, because I really think it could be a great thing.
Well, I have been having just the most marvelous conversation with Art Bell, and we're going to wind the show down just a little bit. And I'm wondering, in all of your experiences, can you share with us, beyond the stories you've already told us, and any kind of experiential story that's weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or just plain funny?
Okay, check this out. When I was at Comedy Central, we got a call from a guy named Bill Maher, and he says, look, I got this show to pitch. And so we met him, my partner and I. He was a co-head of programming. We met him in a diner in L.A., and he pitched us a show. And he said, you know what the problem with talk shows is? Nobody talks. They don't really talk. I want to do a talk show where people really talk, and I want to call it Politically Incorrect. We bought it on the spot. We said, okay, 12 episodes, let's go. We had no money for it, zero. Anyway, we put the show on the air. We get the show going. First 6 months, not doing too well, but we're doing the best we can. Then suddenly it starts to get an audience. Now, at that point, I'm also responsible for marketing. So I say, you know what? I'm going to build a marketing campaign around this guy. So we do a marketing campaign around Politically Incorrect. And as you have to do in a corporation, I showed it to everybody. I showed it to his producers. I showed it to his writers. I showed it to, everybody who had to see it. But I didn't show it to Bill. Now, why didn't I show it to Bill? Because Bill's very opinionated, and I didn't want Bill to be the head of marketing on this thing. So I didn't show it to Bill. So the thing breaks, and it's all over the place. And Bill calls me up, and he says, I saw that ad campaign. I said, yeah. He says, and I'm going to get you fired. I said, Bill, you can't get me. He said, I hate it. It's terrible. Knows nothing about the show. Doesn't know anything about me. It really, represents me badly, and I'm going to get you fired. And he hangs up. Now, he didn't get me fired because he couldn't, but he didn't like me much after that. Anyway, cut to, I get a call from the ad agency months later. Hey, we've been nominated for an award for the Bill Maher campaign. A big award. He says, and I got tickets to the award show. So let's go. So we go to the award show. And this is almost unbelievable. Bill Maher was the host. Now, I didn't know he was going to be the host, and he didn't know I was going to be there. Anyway, he's the host, and up comes the campaign, for best campaign, outdoor campaign in New York or something like that. And he turns around and says, "That's my campaign." And guess what? We won. He turns around, looks at the thing again, and says, "Now that's advertising." He walked out that night, passed our table, didn't say a thing to us.
Oh, wow. Still upset about it, huh?
Is that a crazy story, though?
That's a crazy story. Now, I've never met him. I do watch his show. He kind of has a little bit of that acerbic character to him. That's sort of
a little bit. I mean, look, I'm not going to tell stories out of school, but I will tell one coda to that thing. I did the book, Constant Comedy, and I did my own reading of the book, of the memoir for the audiobook, because you can do that with a memoir. And I got, I was checking out the reviews one day, and I got this horrible review, 1 star. And I hadn't seen that before. And I read it, I kept reading, and I said, my gosh, this is terrible. This guy is taking personal shots at me. And I showed it to my wife, and she says, "Oh, that's Bill Maher. Bill Maher wrote that review." And I said, "Yeah, you're right." Because he said, the only worthwhile chapter in the book is the chapters on Bill Maher. And who does Art Bell think he is? It's like, of course it was Bill Maher. Anyway, can you imagine holding a grudge for 30 years?
Oh my God. Well, welcome to Hollywood. It's like, good night.
Right. You'll never work in this business again, but I did.
Exactly right. So, all right, last question for you today, Art. You've shared with us actually a really significant amount of advice already throughout the show, but I'm wondering, do you have a single solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give to those who are starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get up to that next level?
Well, what I like to talk about is what you do with an idea, because anybody going into the entertainment business is creative and wants to pitch ideas. My big idea was comedy, but you end up pitching all kinds of things. And I wrote 10 rules. This is when you're making your pitch. Okay, first of all, you got to have an elevator pitch. Make it exciting, inject passion. Think of Bruce Springsteen, Born to Run. Second, if it's an investment kind of thing, like you got to raise money for a movie, let investors, others, feel the passion in every communication. Everyone, electrify them. 3, understand everything about your potential customer or audience through research. I got to tell you, research is so important in the entertainment business. 4, expect setbacks. Don't dwell on them, fix the problem. 5, talk to everyone about your idea in order to hone them. 6, find allies and advocates. 7, assess your strengths and weaknesses. You can't do everything. 8, identify the competition. Who are you up against? 9, check your vision. How will your new venture or movie or television show change the world? And that's how you have to talk about it. 10, be prepared to compromise. And especially in the entertainment business. Steve, am I right on that? And 11, I said there were 10, but there's 11. Be prepared to fail. Nobody does something great by avoiding failure. Go for success, and failure sometimes leads to great insights and great success. That's my advice.
In my book, Beating Hollywood, I have a chapter called Fail Upward. Failing is part of the process, and you must fail in order to succeed, to learn, but you've got to fail in a way that takes you upward. You have to allow yourself to learn from it. And if you dwell on it and get depressed about it, you're not going to help yourself. So I think that's those 11 pieces of advice are absolutely tremendous. And I thank you for sharing them. And this has just been a tremendously wonderful, fun time on the show for me. And I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and for your great wisdom.
Oh, it was absolutely a pleasure talking to you about it. And I really appreciate you.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.